Well, hello to everyone, and welcome as we continue our look into the first 100 days of the presidency of Joe Biden. By the time we have completed this 8-lecture series, we will be 4 months into a new administration. We will have a relatively stable cabinet and set of advisors selected, something we're going to look at in April. And then we'll hopefully be able to deviate away a bit from contemporary American politics, especially American presidential politics, and hopefully begin to gather live once again, as hopefully everybody has either already been vaccinated or will be very soon. Before we begin our topic today, a look at the unique nature of the American Republic, that as a federal republic, and the characteristics of that type of government and the various rights apportioned to the national government and those left to the states. We're standing here in the middle of February witnessing a very unusual event, an unprecedented event in American presidential history. As we know, following the events last month on June the 6th, wherein the Capitol was invaded and attacked by an insurrectionist mob, 1 week later, on January 13th, the House of Representatives impeached President Trump for the second time, accusing him this time with the single count of inciting that insurrection. So, according to the Constitution, while the House has the sole power of impeachment, of bringing constitutional accusations, in this case against a president, the Senate has the sole right to sit as a jury and ultimately judge whether or not the House is able to prove the allegations contained in articles of impeachment. So we've watched as House managers have come into the well of the Senate trying to carry the burden of proving that President Trump, really on and before January the 6th, was responsible for bringing about this breach of the Capitol, as the electoral votes that had been certified by states were in the process of being tabulated and formally counted. Now, we know that earlier this week, the Senate had to confront a unique constitutional question. And that is, even though, yes, Donald Trump was president when he was charged by the House, impeached by the House on January the 13th, since that time, of course, he has left office. And a very relevant, I think, constitutional question is whether or not a former president can in fact be put through a trial in the Senate pursuant to articles of impeachment. In a vote on the constitutionality of that process, I believe 56 senators voted to find this process constitutional. 44 believed that it did not conform with the Constitution, and thus the trial began. Now, ultimately, probably by the weekend of the 13th and the 14th of February, or very early in the week thereafter, the trial is going to conclude and the Senate is going to vote, and the requirement for conviction and then disbarment from holding future federal office is a high bar. 67 out of 100 senators will have to vote to convict. Now, judging by the vote on the constitutionality of the trial being held, even judging by some of the on-the-record comments of Republican senators that are sitting in judgment of this former Republican president, it does not appear that that very high number, 67, is going to be met. But this process, again, is an application of one set out and articulated in the Constitution by the men who wrote it as a means, again, for removing from office high office holders, including presidents, accused of committing high crimes and misdemeanors in office. We'll talk more about the conclusion of that trial in our next lecture. Today, we want to discuss how the Constitution created a federal system of governing for the then 13 United States of America. What exactly does this concept of federalism mean? What did it mean in the mind of the framers? And then later, certainly by the early 20th century, how the nature of federalism began to change as the national government, the federal government, began to delve into areas, particularly regarding investigation and regulation that previously had been thought to be only within the province of the individual states. Now, we've heard over the past few months, if we're following news and important events, allusions to this concept of federalism, to this division of power between the national government, we call it the federal government, and the government of the individual states. As we began responding almost a year ago to the challenges posed by the coronavirus, it eventually became the position of President Trump and his administration that because the Constitution says that states have the responsibility for providing for the general welfare of its citizens, it was actually primarily up to the states and their governors and their legislatures, state by state by state, to determine how they were going to deal with things like shutdowns, like mask ordinances, like when it was proper to open restaurants and open workplaces. And I think it's fair to say that over time, there were 50 different varieties of responses that each of the individual states initiated, while all the while the federal government viewed itself as a supporter, as a facilitator in the distribution of PPE, in the distribution of ventilators, in funding and shepherding through the development of therapeutic medicines, and ultimately vaccines. All of these were functions carried out by the federal government. And then, of course, we've seen how each individual state and even counties within individual states have viewed different means and different parts of the population who should begin to receive this vaccine first. And again, the argument regarding how it was handled was indeed one based on this concept of federalism. For several months leading up to the presidential election on November the 3rd, and then in the 2 months that followed, of course culminating with the events of January the 6th, we were watching yet another example of federalism in action, because as we've mentioned before, even though the Constitution created the office of president, empowered it, created requirements that the individual that occupied that office must meet, and then, of course, created in the Electoral College system a process for Americans electing its president, the Constitution left to the individual states and their legislatures the powers to determine how they were going to run their elections. And thus we saw, particularly under the heat of COVID, many states beginning to expand ways for citizens to vote. Some states, as was their right, had years ago created methods of mail-in voting, had created many opportunities for early voting, while others prior to last year had not. Thus, a number of states, and again, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan come to mind, had to very quickly put into operation absentee voting, early voting, and most particularly mail-in voting opportunities in order to give their citizens a right to vote in the middle of a pandemic. And as the votes were tabulated, and as the president began to express skepticism regarding the results in many states, that skepticism was in fact based on the fact that individual states had done what the Constitution clearly empowered individual states to do, to make the laws regarding their elections. So we have a very long history as a country that is a republic in the sense that individual rights and individual freedoms are guaranteed to every citizen in a constitution, which also delineates the powers of those who hold federal office, the length of their terms, and the rules regarding the interrelationship between Congress, the president, and the courts. But in addition to embracing a Republican form of government, the framers of our Constitution also chose to create a federal aspect to it, to create a federal system of government, so that whatever government was ultimately created to serve as the national government was going to have to coexist with the already existing state governments. And then eventually, hopefully, as our country grew in the number of states, there would be additional state governments that again would have certain powers that they would operate, while the federal government was limited to those powers given to it in the Constitution. It was very much an experiment in taking some of the most enlightened political thought that had been bouncing around Europe, certainly through the 18th century, through the 1700s. A lot of that thought, of course, found its way to some of the founding fathers of the United States, men who had the benefit of some of the best educations available both in the United States and in Great Britain. Some who were very well read, some who were very well traveled, as they attempted, following America winning its independence, to form a new type of government of the people, by the people, and for the people of the United States. Now, much of this process was informed, of course, by the previous history of the 13 colonies, which eventually would become the first 13 American states. We know, of course, that during the great age of exploration and settlement, that North America, the place where the United States and Canada lie today, was one of the maybe easiest to reach places, And one of the places where the great European colonizing countries saw great opportunities for raw materials, for maybe the resettlement of residents, and for growing the power and the wealth of whichever hereditary monarch happened to lead the government in question. Eventually, by the 1730s, Great Britain, of course, had come into possession of what would become the 13 original American colonies running up and down the Atlantic seaboard of the United States from Georgia all the way up north to New Hampshire. And we'd seen, up until this period of time, a great amount of migration, immigration, transmigration of people leaving parts of Great Britain to find a new home, a new start, a better life in British colonized parts of North America. And for a very long time, we recognized that there were distinct migration patterns where, for instance, farmers more inland in Great Britain made their way to colonies whose primary source of commerce were farming, cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, and the like. We saw some of the coastal British residents, fishermen, many of them, gravitating to some of the colonies in the Northeast, where the abundant fishing waters of the North Atlantic created great opportunities for their prosperity. Eventually, we would see London-trained craftsmen make their way across to some of the mid-Atlantic colonies, and it indeed was in Rhode Island and in Boston and in Philadelphia, where some of the first furniture makers and manufacturers, if we might call them that, began to ply their trade on this side of the pond. Because the free population of the British colonies in America were overwhelmingly British by birth, British by ancestry, were fluent in English, were familiar with British customs, British literature. If they were devout, and most of them were, they practiced some Western European Protestant religion, very familiar to the folks back in the motherland in Great Britain. These colonies, of course, particularly the southern ones, would begin to import a whole generation of involuntary immigrants, African slaves, part of a nearly worldwide slave trade, finding their way primarily into the southern agricultural colonies to be bought, sold, bred, beasts of labor in order to do the work required in labor-intensive farming areas. For a long period of time, certainly into the 1740s and the 1750s, the colonies in America enjoyed a very warm and a very fraternal relationship with the government in Great Britain. It's a good thing they did, because during that time and during the age of monarchism, governments were described as being unitary governments, that wherever laws were made at the very top, in Britain perhaps by the king, with members of parliament as advisors, those laws were then forced upon smaller subdivisions of Great Britain, counties, parishes, cities, who didn't have lawmaking powers of their own. And then, of course, these laws were exported to be forced upon those living in British colonies all around the world. And for a long period of time, because the colonies were very productive and were able to send a lot of primarily raw materials into a British worldwide system of commerce, and then at the same time develop enough wealth in the colonies to be consumers of goods, making their way from other parts of the British-controlled world. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies was described as one of salutary neglect. The British didn't have to expend a lot in manpower, in troops, in mass incarcerations to cause the colonists to live and thrive and contribute to British society. Compared, for instance, to places like British colonial India and parts of of Africa, where the force of British troops were very much needed to compel the indigenous peoples there to work. In British America, transplanted Europeans very much understood and contributed without much resistance to integrating themselves into the British world. Now, for reasons that we'll describe very quickly, in particular, the French and Indian War, a front in the 6 Years' War, that was 7 Years' War, that was fought between Britain and France all around the world. Beginning around 1755, Britain would in fact have to expend a lot of its treasure, a lot of its troop strength, a lot of its military strength. Troops had to be paid, troops had to be housed, troops had to be armed and fed, and of course they incurred casualties in the fighting that took place in the northern part of the British colonies and in what are today the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. After very fierce fighting, in 1763, by virtue of a treaty, this worldwide war between the British and the French came to an end. And regarding North America, France was essentially banished, removed as a threat, as a force in the affairs of Britain's colonies here. But in the eyes of the British Crown, through the eyes of the British Parliament, quite a bit had changed because of the fact that in order to preserve the livelihood of these colonial residents, the British Treasury had expended a lot of pounds. The military incurred a lot of casualties in order to protect the livelihood of these colonial residents. So over the remainder of the 1760s and into the 1770s, Britain was determined to be compensated for the actions they had taken during this conflict. The primary means eventually was taxation. Taxation imposed on just about every good that colonial residents relied on in their daily lives: sugar, tea, paper, coffee, stamps, lead. And eventually, after some opposition and resistance from these British ancestored individuals living in the colonies, the Crown was forced to use a greater military presence, both to put down opposition to taxation and to facilitate in the collection of taxes. So we would see what earlier had been 13 colonies, each of whom viewed their primary connection and their primary association as one that stretched from North America across the Atlantic Ocean to the mother country, Great Britain. 13 of them. Again, Georgia, the Carolinas, the Mid-Atlantic, all the way to New Hampshire, seeing much more commonality of interest and much more interconnection with Great Britain than they did with each other. Then they did view a commonality of interest between Georgians and Carolinians and New Yorkers, etc., because primarily they viewed themselves as British by birth, British by ancestry, and as residents of one particular British colony in North America, the 13 original ones. So, as often happens in these types of events, some of the first colonial residents to recognize the great changes that were underway by virtue of the increasing British intolerance, the increasing taxation without representation, the increasingly hostile acts of the British military, were, in some cases, some of the wealthiest residents of the colonies, whose fortunes were perhaps being most affected by the imposition of taxes. Some of the best educated colonial residents who were reading some of the early volumes of ancient history, the experiments of the Greeks and the Romans with self-government and republicanism, and then some of the writings coming more recently from the Enlightenment, men like John Locke talking about the universal rights of all men, or a French nobleman, Montesquieu, who began to look at power and absolute power as something that must be diluted, must be separated, must be balanced in order to be less tyrannical. And as the wheels started spinning in the minds of some of America's early thinkers, new conceptions of how to properly form a government, greater hostility and resistance to the current nature of British rule would lead to a recognition, metaphorically, of all of these colonial leaders, looking up and down the Atlantic seaboard and somehow recognizing that they were all in the same boat, that they all were commonly and mutually the recipients of this British hostility. And certainly in the minds of some of the early leaders of America's independence movement, again, metaphorically, many began to cut the ties of connection that had linked them to the mother country, and maybe thought that now was the time to retie, to rebind their fortunes and their efforts with each other, jointly dealing with these acts that were now increasingly being described as acts of tyranny directed to them, at them, by, again, this British government, this oppressive British king and his ministers. So we know what happened. These men began corresponding, venting about the challenges faced by these oppressions. Eventually, they began meeting surreptitiously in places like Annapolis and in Baltimore. And finally, of course, the colonies agreed that they would send representatives to Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 to produce a document that would collectively be the opinions of colonial residents regarding a new and changed relationship between themselves and the British government, ultimately declaring independence from British rule. Now, by this time, by the 1770s, in one form or another, in more tolerant fraternal times, the British Crown, through royal governors appointed to oversee the colonies, had permitted just about every one of them to establish their own legislatures and have some experience with a legislative process, elected members of a colonial body making laws in certain limited areas that the governors permitted them to do. The earliest, of course, was the Virginia House of Burgesses, which had been established way back in 1619. And it was indeed many of these local limited legislative bodies located in a colonial capital that first built the feelings of nationalism. At the time, of course, nationalism meant I am a loyal New Yorker, or I am a Pennsylvanian, or I am a Virginian. We've got a capital, we have this limited ability to make laws, all of which eventually were eliminated and denied to these colonial residents during, again, the difficult times of the 1760s and the 1770s. So by 1776, many of the delegates who, of course, ultimately would write the Declaration of Independence had had an experience with some type of representative government. They were buttressed and fortified by the fact that many of these delegates had done a tremendous amount of reading and thinking about ways to create more perfect governments. So in writing the Declaration of Independence, the framers of that document used it to accomplish a number of very important, fundamental, foundational propositions, which of course would be built upon after independence from Great Britain had indeed been won. First was the proposition expressed early in the Declaration of Independence of we find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke's Universal Rights of Men had found its way into the Declaration. Further, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That, in essence, describes a government whose leaders are selected by the people and thus are accountable to the people who elected them. Not a monarch accountable to God, not some unelected tyrant accountable to no one, but instead governments accountable to the citizenry who elected them. It goes a little further to say that whenever citizens are deserved by their government, they have the right to remove that government and institute new government. Make a new kind of government that will better enable citizens to pursue their worldly goals. The Declaration then goes on in very fine detail to list grievances, evidence of how the British government had violated those self-evident truths, how the British government had not permitted citizens to enjoy life, liberty, and happiness, how the actions of the British government were working to the detriment of colonial residents, and how certainly, having described the king numerous times as either oppressive or as a tyrant, was not accountable to those people subject to his rule. The Declaration, following this long articulation of grievances, goes on to conclude that by virtue of the argument made, the colonies, now calling themselves states, consider themselves to be free and independent states. All political connection between them and the state of Great Britain are hereby dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they claim the right to make law, initiate treaties, commence commerce, and do all other things that a free people ought of right be able to do. Now, the release of this document, the Declaration of Independence, and the contents within it would mark a watershed moment, not just, of course, for the fate of these 13 British colonies, but over the next 200 years, really 250 years up until the present time, the precepts and the theories and the logic contained in the Declaration of Independence would be considered the inspiration of so many people all around the world trying to win the right to govern themselves from some form of government that was oppressive, tyrannical, monarchic, non-democratic. Now, the king and the parliament, of course, would eventually find out about this remarkable document that had been signed in Philadelphia in July of 1776. But the document, after it was written and signed, was immediately duplicated and then sent to the 13 states, the 13 colonies, in order to educate the average colonial resident who viewed himself as, again, someone who was either a Georgian or a Delawarean, but of British descent. And the purpose of the Declaration was to cause a colonial resident, maybe someone well-educated, maybe someone not too well-educated, be he a farmer or a shopkeeper or a doctor or a laborer, to come to the conclusion after reading that document, or in some cases having that document read to him, that colonial leaders had come to earlier, that the time had come for colonial residents to cut the ties that primarily bound them to the mother country, and again, be ready to tie their fortunes with their fellow colonial residents and the residents of each of the other colonies, all making common cause to win their independence. The record shows that this document indeed was extraordinarily effective in winning hearts and minds over to the cause of independence. There were a few that remained loyal to the British, a lot of these New Yorkers and these rich Tories among them. So the British government, of course, responded to this bold assertion of independence with military force. Military force at a time when unquestionably Great Britain was the world's most powerful country with the world's most powerful military. We would see that what had been earlier battles being fought sporadically, like those outside of Boston at Lexington and Concord in 1775, and others that followed, become more of a war in what was then considered, in the traditional sense, a war. And we would see these 13 states suddenly have to figure out how they were going to come together in order to raise an army, in order to go abroad and acquire weapons, maybe acquire allies. And in 1777, colonial representatives came together and agreed to a document known as the Articles of Confederation. A confederation being a loosely held together combination of autonomous states that have a very limited national government with very limited purposes and powers, because at the time, states were very leery of ceding powers that they might possess to some new mysterious Confederation government and the Confederation Congress, as it was known. So we recognize that in modern times there have been attempts to form governments that purport to be confederations and have seen that the weakness in the way in which the national government was empowered to act on behalf of the members of the Confederation has usually doomed confederations to being broken up and dissolved. But I think it's fair to say that in 1777, the Articles of Confederation were the closest thing the colonies were going to get to being able to do some things that one entity, the Confederation government and its legislature, could do on behalf of 13 separate states. So, indeed, George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, was appointed and commissioned and answered not to the Virginia militia, but instead to the Confederation Congress. We know that emissaries were sent abroad and eventually succeeded in helping to acquire munitions and weapons and allies like France, who would play a very large role, certainly in helping the naval aspect of the war against the British Navy. But we know that French troops and French military advisors, like the Marquis de Lafayette, would play an important role in helping the Continental Army ultimately defeat the British. The British were defeated, of course, after 7 years of fighting in a war that had become very unpopular back in Great Britain. What are we fighting for? Where are our loved ones? Why is so much treasure being directed towards holding on to these 13 British-oriented states? So after Washington's army had trapped one of the major British armies, led by Lord Cornwallis in Virginia, and Cornwallis surrendered to Washington's army, negotiations that had been ongoing in Paris accelerated, and eventually in 1783, in the Treaty of Paris, Britain recognized the sovereignty of the United States. So the British withdrew, and one must imagine in 1783, 1784, 1785, the leaders of the 13 states began looking at each other and wondering, what in the heck are we going to do now? For a time, that weak Confederation legislature attempted to govern in peacetime, as it had been compelled to do during times of war, but because any matter that the Confederation legislature considered had to receive the unanimous vote of a representative from each of the 13 states, very little was done. And after events like Shays' Rebellion revealed that the United States did not have a readily buildable standing army, a militia to put down uprisings of that type, after commerce could not be easily conducted because of the fact that different states had begun imposing and collecting tariffs on goods passing over borders to be sold in those states. Because some states began speaking of minting their own coins and creating their own currencies. Imagine a different currency in 13 different states. It became clear, it became evident to the leaders of the states that the Articles of Confederation were fatally flawed, and something had to be created to replace it. Again, a confederation, a loose union of states, almost certainly would have broken apart because there was not a stronger federal presence to facilitate relationships among and between the states, and then, of course, with the rest of the world. So we know what happened next. In the summer of 1787, every state except Rhode Island sent a delegation to Philadelphia in order to take part in what came to be known, of course, as the Constitutional Convention. Rhode Island, a small state geographically, a state with a smaller population, had leaders who were very wary of creating a government in which Rhode Island would have to give more of its sovereign powers to, again, a newly created national government. When we consider what the goals were in bringing together this Constitutional Convention, a couple come to mind. Ultimately, it had to do with the concept of power and the idea that there is a potentially unlimited amount of power that a government could exercise, and the less delineation of what a government could do and could not do, and the greater opportunity for just one individual or a few individuals to exercise that power, were in the minds of the framers a prescription for eventually finding another oppressive, tyrannical government at work. So, again, borrowing in some respects from the Frenchman Montesquieu, James Madison, who had authored a blueprint of sorts for the creation of the Constitution, a document called the Virginia Plan, was one in which the nature of power and the threat of power would be tempered by separating it. Separating it, in fact, in a number of different ways. Now, when Americans are educated regarding this period of time and come to gain an understanding of the Constitution, when one hears the separation of power, one immediately thinks of the three branches of what we now call our federal government, the national government. Because indeed, it was in its creation a great exercise in taking whatever finite, limited powers that the states were going to give to the national government and separating it. A lawmaking function placed within the United States Congress. An executive entity, one person, the President of the United States, and then an umpire, an entity that would be able to determine whether or not the legislature and the president were acting in conformity to the Constitution. The federal judiciary were created, powers separated among them, and then, of course, a very renowned system of checks and balances, making it difficult for one of three hopefully co-equal branches of government from becoming more powerful than the other. And in many ways, what we're watching right now, this impeachment process, is a very good example of the checks and balances that were built in to the Constitution by giving each House of Congress a distinct role to play in an action ultimately that could result in the removal of a sitting president. So we know, and we've talked about the idea of separation of power at the federal level. But in many ways, the more subtle, the more critical, the more brilliant separation was the framers' determination to create in the United States a federal republic. Federal meaning the creation of additional governments, a different layer of governments, one per state, that would have certain rights explicitly given to it, and in the mind of the framers would have all the other rights that perhaps had not been articulated in the Constitution determined by state legislatures, because the federal government, the national government, was initially viewed as one with limited, finite powers. So when we talk about the national government, the federal government that was created in the Constitution, at the Constitutional Convention, we must do so understanding that already each of the 13 states in the United States at the time had governments of their own. Everyone had a constitution. Some had declarations of rights, this idea that in a republic, certain rights are identified and guaranteed to all citizens. Every state had a legislature, every state had a governor, every state had a court system. Had the Constitution not been written and ultimately ratified, the government that had existed as a confederation under the Articles of Confederation almost certainly would have splintered, and then in theory, each state and its legislature would have all potential governing powers onto itself. And in the writings of the framers of the Constitution, made at the time that they gathered, thank God so many of these delegates were prodigious diarists or letter writers and sent a lot of information to friends and spouses and correspondents or in their diaries. Every night recited what had taken place during that day's deliberations. You know, imagine if they could send smiley faces and hearts, or were playing with their cell phones. Instead, we know that there was a lot of thought and a lot of leery consideration of how this national government would be empowered. Because at the time of the writing of the Constitution, and even in the years that followed, the federal government in many respects was more of an abstraction than an actual concrete entity. The Constitution spoke to there being a national capital, but we know that it would not be until some time later that the location of what would become Washington, D.C. was determined by the states. And we know that if one were to read the Constitution in the late 1780s or the 1790s, you know, one would read of Congress and a House of Representatives and a Senate, and not have the benefit like we do of being able to associate that with a Capitol building and a place on one side where the Senate meets, on the place on the other side where the House meets. And if we think very hard, we could probably all imagine one or two effective members of the House and the Senate. You know, you read about this guy, the president, with all of these powers, and then once again, you know, you look and you believe, boy, this is mighty powerful. What might this guy do? Without the benefit that we have of the White House and of now 46 presidents having been elected to lead our country. A Supreme Court, again, lightly alluded to in the Constitution, certainly not the federal judiciary that many of us have come to know, and many of us still, you know, happen to admire for enforcing the rule of law. So the job of empowering the national government, the federal government, was essentially one where the states would have to decide which powers it possessed were going to be collectively given to this new national government or federal government. And again, I always use the briefcase example where every state arrived at the convention with a bag that contained, theoretically, every possible right that a government could possess, and each of the 13 states had their bag full, theoretically, of every possible right that a government could possess, so that the power of building the national government, the federal government, was an exercise in the states at the convention reaching into their bag, pulling out a power, looking at each other, and then collectively giving it to this federal government that it was creating. And we consider these rights to be among the express powers, the enumerated powers that were given to our federal government. And if you think about it, back in 1787, and now 240 years later almost, they make a lot of sense that one government should possess these rights instead of 13 or 50 of them exercising it themselves. Under the Constitution, the powers of the federal government, particularly the powers of Congress, are articulated. Congress, and only Congress, the federal government, has the ability to print money, to declare war, to establish an army and a navy, and of course, inherently, to determine the requirements for individuals that would serve in these military branches, to enter into treaties with foreign governments. Better one treaty on behalf of the United States than, 13 separate ones. To regulate interstate commerce and international trade. To make the rules and set the laws for how trade is going to be established over state lines, between states. Got to get rid of these tariffs and these tolls and all of these crazy ideas that some states had before. Now, as we go into our lectures next month, when we look first at the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, at a time when the national government, the federal government, would begin to expand its reach into matters that before had thought to belong to the states. And then our second lecture, when we look at the first 100 days of the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt and how so many federal departments and agencies were created because individual states alone could not handle the matters in a modern America. And then if we think forward to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and again, the many pieces of federal legislation that would come out of it, like, for instance, the Civil Rights Act. Many of these agencies, the FDA, one of the first created, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, another early one, the FCC, the FAA, various types of antitrust law, all of these departments could be created by the federal government, by Congress, because Congress asserted that all of the subject matter of these entities were engaged in interstate commerce. So a congressional power that had laid dormant for the most part in the Constitution into the days leading up to the Civil War, and even in the decades following the Civil War, even though the United States, by the building of railroads, by the refining of oil, by the development of a country of vast industrial power, rapidly urbanizing, quickly growing by great amounts of immigration, was a country that individual states could no longer handle the most pressing issues of the time. So only during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, and then continuing later to FDR, and even later to Lyndon Johnson, would Congress begin to see that in the Constitution, this power to regulate commerce between the states was a great opening, a hook to give it the power to do things at the national level on behalf of every state. When Article 1, Section 8 concluded by giving Congress, quote, the power to make any law necessary to perform its constitutional duties, the so-called necessary and proper clause. Maybe in school you heard it referred to as the elastic clause, because it could be stretched and pulled and contorted to provide Congress with the nexus to identify an issue that it views as being involved in interstate commerce, and use the necessary and proper clause in order to build, for instance, the executive agencies that would be empowered by Congress to provide, again, the nationwide regulation and problem solving that individual states could not do. More, a lot more about that next month. Now, there were powers that, of course, were reserved to the states in the Constitution. These are matters that belong to the states, and they include the right to establish local governments, counties, often the official political subdivision of a state, cities located within counties, to issue licenses of various types. Today, driver's license, hunting license, marriage license, etc. States still had the power to regulate commerce taking place within their own borders. Intrastate commerce is within the province of the state. States, and only states, had the ability to change the Constitution by ratifying a proposed constitutional amendment sent to it by actions of the House and the Senate. 3/4 of the state legislatures have to vote to amend the Constitution. States have the responsibility to provide for the public health and safety of their citizens. Again, COVID, leave it to the states. The Constitution said that that's their responsibility. A decade ago, many critics of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, viewed that as a federal usurpation of a power that the Constitution says resides at the state level, state by state by state. And states can exercise powers that are not prohibited to it by the Constitution, nor expressly given to the federal government. Things like setting, a state drinking age or a smoking age, things of that type. The Constitution gave concurrent powers to the federal government and the state governments. Both of them could act in the following areas, and these are just a few. Of course, creating and collecting taxes, building highways, state highway building, federal highway building, borrowing money, creating debt to fund many of these projects, making and enforcing laws within the bounds of their constitutions, chartering banks and corporations, spending money for the benefit of the general welfare, and both the federal government and state governments had the power to take private property via eminent domain for public improvements, provided there is just compensation for it. So when the job was finished and the Constitution was ratified, we as a country were living in a type of federalism that has been described as dual federalism. The national government, the federal government, had certain limited specific powers, as did each of the individual states. Over time, probably out of the necessity of us living in a more modern, faster moving, industrial society, we would see the type of federalism that exists in our country evolve into one known as concurrent federalism, where through the use of things like the Commerce Clause, supplemented by the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress, the federal government, has reached in and has taken control of many areas of law that at the time of the writing of the Constitution, I suspect, the framers believed, had they come to understand it, would have been within the province of the states. So as a country where federalism is the norm, we recognize that what federalism means today is much more tilted towards the power of the federal government, the national government, vis-a-vis the states, than it was at the time the Constitution itself was actually ratified. 2 years after the Constitution was implemented in 1789, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were ratified by the states. And that, of course, had the effect of initially preventing Congress, the federal government, from intruding into a long list of rights, liberties, and freedoms. Maybe a lot of those being, the inalienable rights that all citizens possess, as a way to further check the power and the reach of the federal government, of the national government. The last of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, sort of sums up, I believe, what the state of mind of the framers were, and what I think a fair reading of the intent of the framers was vis-a-vis or relative to the federal government versus the state government, by saying, and in case anybody hasn't gotten this yet, the 10th Amendment says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, the powers of the federal government, any powers not given to the federal government in the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states by the Constitution, states can't do this in the Constitution, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Because, of course, the preamble, the introductory statement to the Constitution begins with the words, "we the people," symbolizing how all that followed, all that was created in that document, and all the amendments that would follow are the collective creations of the people, acceding to the creation of those entities. Now, we will, in our next few lectures, again, look at how the nature of federalism in the United States changed. How the United States, of course, would grow from 13 states to now 50 states. I don't think Congress has made D.C. a state yet, but who knows, maybe they will if you read the papers these days. And we'll see that even the Bill of Rights, that again were directed towards the actions of Congress. In Supreme Court cases, one, Barron versus Baltimore in 1833. Another one, the United States versus Cruikshank in 1867. The Supreme Court held that the protections stated in the Bill of Rights applied only to actions taken by the federal government or parts of the federal government. And none of those protections applied to actions taken by the states or subdivisions of the states, counties, cities. But it was, in fact, in the late 1860s, that states ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment entitled to cloak the rights of citizenship upon individuals who previously had held the status of enslaved people, which the Dred Scott decision in 1857 said slaves were not persons for purposes of exercising constitutional rights. And it would be in the 14th Amendment, again, which enough states ratified, where states would be identified and where specifically the 14th Amendment would say, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Now, it would take about 50 years, but by the 1920s, the United States would use, in particular, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to begin to take selectively rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. All of the rights from the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly. More recently, the right of keeping and bearing firearms in one's home for self-defense, the Second Amendment. The Fourth Amendment right regarding searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment protections against double jeopardy and compelled confessions, all of the Sixth Amendment rights regarding a person accused of a crime, entitled to a speedy trial, a jury trial, a public trial, to confront witnesses, to have the right to counsel. The Eighth Amendment, prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Up until the early 1920s, all of those rights were protected only against actions by the federal government. Through this process of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, in something known as incorporation, we now live in a time where individual states are now subject to guaranteeing the protections in the Bill of Rights to all their citizens, even if the transgressor happens to be a state entity, a local entity, a county entity, again, thus increasing the footprint of federal power and reducing. States' rights advocates will tell you that their powers, as originally contemplated in creating a federal system in the Constitution, have been eviscerated by an overactive Congress and, again, overzealous courts, expanding all of these protections to be used against the individual states. So I hope everyone has a very happy rest of the month. Watch the news, always lots of interesting stuff occurring. And next month, we will take this line of thought into the 20th century in two lectures entitled The Roosevelts, a look at Theodore Roosevelt and his accelerating Congress utilizing powers given in the Constitution, and then, of course, the first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency in 1933. So we'll see everybody again very soon. Take care.